a werewolf shifter romance audiobook written by Annabelle. When you learn that mercy has a price, the cost is always higher than you imagine paying. That's how Elena's choices begin. The day the royal courier arrives at their trading post is the day mercy reveals its true expense. She'd built her life on careful calculations. The weight of silk against copper coins, the value of spices measured in silver. Growing up, she'd mastered the art of negotiation, of finding worth in what others overlooked, of turning small advantages into survival. But some debts can't be negotiated away. Some prices must be paid in full, no matter how steep. And the cruelest part isn't the payment itself. It's discovering that what you thought you valued most was never truly yours to begin with. Chapter 1. The royal courier's silver eyes gleamed in the afternoon light streaming through their trading post windows. Elena watched from behind the counter as her father clutched the official scroll, his weathered hands trembling. Her younger brother Marcus pressed against their father's side, confusion written across his 12-year-old face. "The Crown's protection tax has tripled this quarter," the courier announced, his voice echoing through their small space. "By order of Prince Cassian of Valdress." Elena's father shook visibly. Like all merchants along the mountain trade routes, he knew the stories about the prince. How even the royal council feared him. How he'd spent 3 years locked in the northern tower before emerging, changed. Whispers spread throughout the kingdom about Cassian's cruelty, how his own guards flinched at his approach. At least nobility had the protection of rank and title. Common merchants were essentially tools to be used and discarded at will. And Elena, she was considered less valuable than most. Born with the sight, the ability to perceive emotions as colors, she should have been an asset to her merchant family. Instead, her gift had proven unreliable, flickering in and out like a dying flame. She'd failed her apprenticeship with the capital's merchant guild, failed to secure profitable trade agreements, failed to be the advantage her family needed. Her father had kept her on with bitter practicality. Another set of hands for the shop, though her presence brought no prestige or security. "Master merchant," the courier's silver eyes fixed on Marcus, "we've had reports of your son's exceptional mathematical abilities. The royal academies require talented youth. He'll do nicely as payment." Elena's body went rigid. Everyone knew what happened to children taken for the royal academies. They disappeared into the mountain fortress and were never heard from again, their talents consumed by whatever dark work the prince required. "But he's promised to apprentice with the cartographers' guild," their father protested, voice cracking. "He has a brilliant mind. He'll bring wealth to the kingdom through his work." He stopped suddenly, and Elena's heart dropped as his gaze shifted to where she stood arranging inventory. The calculation in his eyes was unmistakable. "Take my eldest daughter instead." The courier's lip curled. "You offer the prince a defective seer?" "Her gift comes and goes," her father said, each word a hammer blow to Elena's chest. "But she has other uses. She reads and writes in 5 languages. She knows every trade route from here to the eastern ports." He paused. "She's perfect for administrative work. No loss to our family business. No loss to the guild. No loss to the guild." The courier repeated thoughtfully. "But what gain to the prince?" "She tells stories," Marcus blurted out, then shrank back from the courier's sharp glance. "Beautiful stories. About merchants who become heroes, about magic and adventure." Elena closed her eyes briefly. How many times had they mocked her storytelling? Called it a frivolous waste of time when she should be memorizing profit margins and trade laws? Yet now they offered it as her only value. "Show him, Elena." Her father grabbed her arm, pulling her forward. "Tell him yourself." Elena lifted her head slowly. At least in the prince's fortress, she thought with bitter clarity, no one would expect her to be anything but what she was. Broken, unreliable, useful only for menial tasks. "I would be honored to serve Prince Cassian in whatever capacity he requires, my lord," she said steadily. The courier studied her for a long moment. Something calculating flickered behind those silver eyes, as if he were weighing variables she couldn't see. Finally, he nodded. "Very well. The defective one will suffice." Outside, he shifted into his courier form, a massive silver hawk, and Elena climbed onto a cart he'd arranged. As they wound up the mountain path toward the fortress, Elena didn't look back at her family. She'd learned long ago that stories were the only escape that truly mattered. Tonight, in whatever cell they kept her in, she'd imagine a story where her family fought for her, where her brother protested her sacrifice, where her father regretted his choice, where being broken didn't mean being disposable, where a woman's worth wasn't measured solely by her useful abilities. She was skilled at creating happy endings, even when they never materialized in real life. Especially because they never did. Chapter 2. When dawn broke, Elena caught her first glimpse of Prince Cassian's fortress. Rising from the mountainside like a blade thrust into stone, its dark towers pierced the morning sky. It was more imposing than anything she'd imagined. All sharp angles and shadowed alcoves that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. Yet something about its stark beauty unsettled her. She knew from merchant tales that the most dangerous bargains always came wrapped in attractive terms. The silver-eyed courier who'd brought her shifted back to human form and grasped her arm. "Move," he ordered, leading her not through the main gates, but along a narrow servant's entrance carved into the mountainside. They descended through torchlit passages to a cold stone chamber, where 4 other young women huddled together, all wearing the same expression of barely contained fear. Elena kept her face blank. She refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her terror. "Strip," a severe woman with iron-gray hair and eyes that held a faint silver sheen commanded. "Now," the girls hesitated. "You're the prince's property," the woman snapped. "What you thought belonged to you, including your modesty, belongs to him." One by one, they removed their clothes, shivering in the cold. Elena moved methodically, folding her garments neatly, refusing to show her humiliation. Into the washing chamber. They were led into another room where servants doused them with ice-cold water. Elena gasped as the first bucket struck her, shock stealing her breath. Rough hands scrubbed every inch of her skin with harsh soap until it felt raw. "The prince won't have dirty merchant filth in his fortress," the gray-haired woman explained, watching their discomfort with clear enjoyment. "Though I doubt any of you will last the month. You're hardly the caliber he usually requires." One girl began crying silently. "Save your tears," the woman sneered. "Prince Cassian is not known for compassion. Learn your place quickly or face consequences." They were given plain gray shifts and instructed on fortress rules. Who to address, where not to tread, the punishments for disobedience. "Tonight," the woman's voice dropped ominously, "one of you will attend to the prince's particular guest." The way she said particular guest made Elena's stomach knot. Images flashed through her mind. Being thrown to wild beasts, offered as some kind of sacrifice to whatever darkness lurked in these mountains. "The prince himself will select which of you has the honor," the woman concluded, eyeing them like merchandise at market. They were led up a narrow staircase to a small antechamber with polished black stone floors. Told to line up and keep their eyes downcast, they waited in tense silence. From beyond the door came approaching footsteps. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The severe woman who'd been tormenting them moments before went rigid, her earlier confidence evaporating. A hand pressed roughly on the back of Elena's neck, forcing her head lower. "His Highness, Prince Cassian of Valdres," a voice announced. The stone beneath Elena's bare feet seemed to pulse with each step he took. She kept her eyes fixed downward, but the air grew heavy, charged with something that pressed against her skin like an approaching storm. "The new arrivals, Your Highness," said a male voice, tight with deference. "For your particular guest's requirements." A long silence followed. Elena could hear the frightened breathing of the girls beside her, one trembling so violently the sound echoed off the stone. "They're all terrified," came a deep voice that resonated through Elena's very bones. It held neither cruelty nor compassion, just a weary disappointment, as though this was exactly what he'd expected. How predictable. Something in that voice, its casual authority, its bone-deep exhaustion, made it impossible for Elena not to look. In all the merchant tales she'd collected from travelers, princes were described with such grandeur. She'd always wondered if real royalty could possibly match the legends. Despite her fear, curiosity won. Slowly, against every instinct for self-preservation, she raised her eyes. What she saw made every legendary figure in her memory seem pale and insufficient. Prince Cassian wasn't merely handsome. He possessed a severe beauty that seemed deliberately crafted to inspire awe and fear in equal measure. Taller than any man she'd seen, with sharp cheekbones and a mouth that curved with what might have been humor in another life, he was darkness given form and purpose. But his eyes, gods, his eyes were wrong. Not silver like the courier's, but completely black. No iris, no white, just endless void that seemed to pull at her, promising to swallow anything foolish enough to gaze too long. and suddenly those eyes snapped to hers. Elena jerked her gaze back to the floor, heart hammering against her ribs. "Your Highness," prompted the attendant nervously. "Have you made your selection?" Elena felt rather than saw his attention still fixed on her. A weight that pinned her in place like a merchant's contract, binding and inescapable. "She'll do," he said simply. She knew without looking that he was pointing directly at her. Chapter 3. Elena stood before a massive obsidian door, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The air felt thinner here, as if the stone itself consumed oxygen. Torches lined the corridor, but their flames bent away from the door, reaching toward her instead, as though seeking escape. Beside her, the stern servant woman wore a tight smile, though her hands trembled visibly. "Satisfy the prince's guest, however he wishes," she whispered, her voice faltering. "Or tomorrow you'll face something far worse than this." The guard at the door looked ill, sweat beading on his forehead despite the mountain cold. When Elena caught his eye, he looked away quickly, his grip whitening on his spear. From inside the room came a sound, somewhere between a sigh and something far more unsettling, resonating through the obsidian like a vibration through merchant scales. The guard's grip tightened further. Then he pushed Elena inside. The space beyond was vast. Not merely a room, but an entire suite of chambers. The air carried a complex mixture of scents, mountain pine, something metallic like fresh-forged iron, and underneath it all, a scent she couldn't name. Wild and electric, like the air before lightning strikes. A mirror caught Elena's eye, but when she turned toward it, her reflection seemed to ripple and distort, as though the glass itself was uncertain of what it should show. She swallowed hard. "Is someone here?" The sensation of being watched pressed against her skin like a physical touch. In the shadows at the room's edge, something shifted, just beyond clear sight. She took a step forward, then another, and suddenly saw a table laid with an elaborate meal. Roasted game, bowls of mountain berries, silver goblets catching torchlight that couldn't quite illuminate the room's dark corners. Elena didn't dare touch anything. Instead, she moved toward the back where heavy curtains hung like funeral shrouds. Pulling them aside, she stopped cold. A bed dominated the space, absurdly large, covered in dark furs and silks that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The implications were clear now. The knowing looks from servants, the uneasy guard, the lavish meal, and this enormous bed. She was meant to be used. Expected to offer her body to whoever the prince kept in these chambers, to service this particular guest in the most intimate way possible. Her stomach lurched, and she pressed a hand to her mouth. But then a package on the bed caught her attention. A card rested atop it, her name written in elegant script that seemed to shimmer slightly in the dim light. With dread pooling in her gut, she unwrapped the parcel. A gown spilled into her hands. Midnight black with silver threading that caught the light like captured starlight. Beautiful and terrifying, like wearing the night sky itself. The temperature dropped precipitously, as though all warmth was being drawn from the room into some invisible void. A sound echoed from behind, slow, deliberate footsteps, accompanied by something else. A faint crackling, like ice forming on stone, and a low sound quickly stifled. Elena turned slowly. The shadows deepened, becoming almost solid. A darkness that consumed rather than concealed. "Put it on." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating through her bones. It was language forced through something that shouldn't speak. Too many tones layered over each other, creating harmonies that hurt to hear. Swallowing hard, she retreated behind a dressing screen, her fingers fumbling with the gown's fastenings. The fabric moved like liquid shadow against her skin, cold and alive. She found jewelry waiting. A necklace of silver formed into constellation patterns she didn't recognize. "Should I wear this as well?" she whispered into the darkness. Silence stretched. Then, closer now. "Yes." Elena clasped it around her throat. The weight was suffocating, like invisible hands pressing against her windpipe. She stepped from behind the screen. The dining area appeared empty, but the presence remained, stronger now. "Please eat." She hesitated before selecting a piece of bread, her fingers steady despite her terror. The flavors turned to ash in her mouth. Behind her, something moved. A shadow fell across the table. Too large, too wrong. "Do you find the dress acceptable?" "Yes," she managed, voice barely audible. "Stand." Her knees wobbled as she obeyed. The presence moved forward, revealing a hand. Except it wasn't truly a hand. More like the shadow of one, darkness given form and substance, with fingers that ended in points of deeper black. Turn around. She did, slowly. Her gaze traveled upward and upward still. The figure before her defied comprehension. Tall as two men, composed entirely of shifting shadow and darkness, with only those terrible black eyes providing any feature. Depthless voids that pulled at her sanity. Elena's lips parted, a scream building in her throat, but what emerged instead was, "You're trapped, aren't you?" The shadow figure recoiled as if struck. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "That was presumptuous of me." "No." The voice was quieter now, almost resigned. "How did you know?" She hesitated. "I've heard many stories from travelers. One about a royal curse to exist as living shadow by a sorcerer he'd wronged. About being neither alive nor dead, trapped between light and darkness." She stopped herself. "I'm rambling." "No." The black eyes locked onto hers. "Continue." So she did. One tale, then another. Speaking of curses and prisons, of humanity hidden beneath horror, of magical bonds that couldn't be broken by force alone. Hours passed. The torches burned lower. "Thank you for your company," the shadow finally rumbled, its voice softer, almost reluctant. "You've made this evening bearable." Relief flooded through her. She had survived with the only weapon she possessed, stories. "Then will you bond with me?" Elena's breath caught. I cannot," she whispered, horrified. The shadow rose to its full, towering height. "Then I have no use for you." The finality in those words sent ice through Elena's veins. Would the prince have her executed for displeasing his shadow companion? Panic clawed at her throat. But in that moment, her merchant's mind, trained to find value in desperate situations, worked faster than her fear. "I pass through hands but never held. I bind agreements never sealed. I'm worth more than gold when freely given but worthless when compelled. Merchants chase me, but I chase fate. What am I?" She blurted out, words tumbling forth. The shadow paused, its formless head tilting slightly. "What is this?" "A riddle," Elena said, her voice steadier now. "From a merchant tale I know." She lifted her chin, summoning every ounce of courage she possessed. "If you can solve this riddle, then I will bond with you as you wish. And if you cannot, then until you do, I hope you will allow me to return each night to tell you more stories." The shadow stared at her for what felt like an eternity. Then, to her astonishment, it exhaled, a sound like wind through mountain passes. "Tomorrow night, then. Do not be late." Chapter 4. When Elena returned to the servants' quarters, the room fell instantly silent. Wide-eyed, the other girls pressed against the walls as she crossed the stone floor, as if proximity to her might carry contamination. The head servant, the iron-gray woman, grabbed Elena's arm with surprising strength, pulling her into a small alcove away from the others. "You're alive," she hissed, her face lined with disbelief. "How?" She cut herself off, glancing over her shoulder nervously. "Say nothing to anyone. Not a word. Understood? The prince will see you at midday." Elena nodded, noting how the woman's fingers trembled despite her stern demeanor. Her survival had clearly disrupted the fortress's established order. Sleep was impossible, her dreams haunted by those depthless black eyes and unanswered riddles. She was jolted awake by rough hands. The sun was already high. A guard stood over her, his face unreadable beneath his helmet. "The prince demands your presence," he stated flatly. "Now." She followed him through a maze of corridors and up unfamiliar staircases to a private chamber. Not a throne room as she'd expected, but a study lined with maps and ledgers and, surprisingly, books. Inside, Prince Cassian stood against a massive window, sunlight streaming around him like a physical thing. Only two others occupied the space: the silver-eyed courier who avoided her gaze, and a woman who looked like a warrior, likely the prince's second-in-command. Cassian's black eyes tracked her as she entered, studying her with cold calculation. Up close in daylight, the beauty that had struck her before seemed even more pronounced, sharp and dangerous and utterly inhuman, as if whatever he'd become had burned away every soft edge. "So," he began, his voice like silk over steel, "you met my guest. What did you think?" Elena lowered her gaze, bowing slightly. "He was generous with his time, as was your highness for selecting me to attend him." A flicker of something, curiosity? Suspicion, crossed Cassian's face. "And that is all you have to say?" he probed. "His highness's guest has requested my presence again tonight," she answered softly, keeping her head down. Cassian moved closer, his presence almost predatory. Will you go? If it pleases your highness. I am indifferent to whether you or another entertains that creature, he said dismissively, though something in his tone suggested otherwise. Elena couldn't hide her reaction to the word creature. Cassian noticed. Does my choice of words disturb you, merchant girl? He leaned in. What word would you use to describe such a horror? The room tensed. The warrior woman's hand moved subtly toward her weapon. Your highness may of course use whichever words he pleases, Elena responded carefully. A heavy silence followed. Then, impulsively, she added, though even shadows deserve dignity. The courier gasped. The warrior paled. Dignity. Cassian's voice went dangerously soft, his black eyes seeming to expand. That shadow is a stain upon my fortress. I show enough dignity by keeping it contained and fed. Elena bowed lower, staying silent as Cassian circled her, each step measured and deliberate. The gown, the jewelry, return them to my second, he ordered. Everything in this fortress belongs to me, and I will not permit a mere servant such luxury. She nodded, her throat tight. And should you speak to anyone of the shadow, he continued, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper, I will know, and I will have you killed immediately. Do you understand? Yes, your highness, she murmured, bowing again. He studied her a moment longer, then dismissed her with a wave. Get her out of my sight. That night, as the fortress fell into darkness and the mountain winds howled, Elena was led once more toward the obsidian door. This time, the guard refused to meet her eyes at all. Chapter 5. Days melted into weeks as Elena's life settled into a strange new rhythm. Nights were spent in the shadow's chambers, and days were filled with the duties of a fortress servant. Each evening followed the same pattern. A beautiful gown awaited her. A feast was laid out, and she told stories until the torches burned to embers. What tale do you have for me tonight? The shadow would ask, its formless body settling across from her, darkness pooling in the chair like spilled ink. She would weave her stories, merchant adventures, tales of distant ports, legends from the eastern kingdoms, always careful to leave them unfinished. And then, it would press as she paused. Tomorrow, she would promise with a hint of a smile. By day, her life was altogether different. Though permitted to sleep later than the others, by noon she was on her knees scrubbing stone floors, her hands raw from harsh soap and cold mountain water. Missed a spot, the prince's second would say, pointing to an invisible imperfection. Start again. The other servants avoided her, their initial curiosity having curdled into something uglier. She carries bad fortune, whispered a kitchen worker. That's why she's still alive. Even death won't take her. She thinks she's special now, an older servant muttered. The prince's favorite. Elena bore their words in silence. Being alone was nothing new. She'd been isolated her entire life, first by her unreliable gift, then by her failures. Occasionally she would encounter Prince Cassian in the corridors. Sometimes he ignored her entirely. Other times his perfect lips would curl in what might have been disgust, or might have been something else entirely. Still alive, I see, he remarked once. My guest must have peculiar tastes indeed. The servants whispered about him constantly, their voices hushed and fearful. He killed the old prince, an elderly gardener confided to another. His own father, they say. I heard it was the queen who died first, came the reply. That's what drove him to it. More rumors circulated, of challengers who entered the northern tower and never emerged, of servants who'd made minor errors and simply vanished. True or not, fear of Prince Cassian permeated every corner of the fortress. Her days weren't pleasant, but her nights. Elena grew to almost cherish them, though after weeks of borrowed tales, her repertoire began to run thin. I'm not sure I have a story tonight, she admitted one evening. The shadow tilted its head, black eyes gleaming. You always have a story. Elena hesitated. The tales she'd collected from travelers had been limited. Most merchants weren't generous with their best material. I could perhaps tell you one of mine, she suggested quietly. Yours. The shadow went completely still, darkness condensing. Your own creation? That night began a transformation in their relationship. No longer was she merely reciting collected tales. She was creating them, weaving narratives from her own imagination. And the shadow was her first true audience. It questioned plot inconsistencies, debated character motivations, suggested unexpected twists that made her stories stronger. But why would the merchant trust his rival after such betrayal? It challenged one night. Because sometimes, Elena replied, We see beyond what others have done to who they truly are underneath. The shadow grew quiet at that. And you believe that? That people or things can change so fundamentally? I believe we can reveal who we truly were all along, Elena said softly. Sometimes cruelty is just armor against a world that only values strength. Those black eyes studied her intently. You speak as if you know something of armor yourself. She did. The armor of competence she'd worn when her gift failed. The armor of indifference when her father offered her as payment. But she only smiled and continued her tale. Their conversations grew longer, deeper, stretching from sunset until the early hours before dawn. Sometimes she would catch herself laughing at its dry observations. Sometimes it would make a sound like pleased rumbling at a particularly clever turn of phrase. One night the shadow surprised her. I have something for you, it said, rising from its chair. It led her through a door she'd never noticed before, revealing a circular chamber-lined floor to ceiling with books and scrolls. A writing desk sat by the window, stocked with fine parchment, quills, and ink in multiple colors. A library? Elena breathed, turning in a slow circle. Her merchant's mind automatically calculated the value. Thousands upon thousands in gold. For me. You mentioned your father wouldn't invest in books for you, the shadow said, almost shy, if such a creature could be shy. I thought perhaps you might like to read new stories. Write your own. Tears pricked her eyes. No one had ever given her such a gift. Not in her entire life. Thank you, she whispered, voice breaking. From that night forward, their discussions became even richer. She would read during the day when her duties allowed, and at night they would debate philosophy, dissect character arcs, argue over narrative structure. Your protagonist is too forgiving, it said one evening as she read from a story she'd written. No one forgives so easily after such deep betrayal. Perhaps she's learned that holding anger hurts her more than the person who wronged her, Elena replied. Or perhaps she's afraid of being alone again, the shadow countered gently. She looked up, startled by its insight. Maybe both. The shadow leaned forward in its chair, darkness rippling. Tell me about her. About why forgiveness comes so easily to someone who's been hurt. Elena set down her pages, her throat tight. She was cast aside by someone who was supposed to value her. Told she was broken, useless. When someone finally shows her kindness, she's terrified of losing it. Why was she cast aside? The question hung in the air. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap. She couldn't give them what they needed most, she said quietly. A reliable gift. She tried for years, but her ability to see emotions, it would flicker in and out like a candle flame in wind. So they called her defective and sent her back to her family like a broken tool. The shadow's sharp intake of breath, like wine through canyon, made her look up. Those black eyes blazed with something fierce and protective. They were fools, it said, voice rough with emotion, to cast aside someone so precious for something beyond her control. Were they? Elena asked, tears threatening. In our world, what is a seer who cannot see? What purpose does she serve? What purpose? The shadow rose, pacing to the window. She tells stories that make the darkness bearable. She sees past shadow to the soul within. She brings light to places that have known only night. Elena wiped her eyes. At least you won't want to bond with me now, I imagine, she said with a broken laugh. Now that you know I'm truly as defective as they say. The shadow whirled around, its massive form trembling with intensity. Elena, I would count myself the most fortunate creature in existence if you would accept me. Broken gift or perfect sight, you are. It stopped as if catching itself before saying too much. You are worth more than a kingdom of those who possess everything but your generous heart. Heat flooded Elena's cheeks, her heart hammering against her ribs. No one had ever spoken to her with such fervor, such conviction. I don't. She stammered, looking away from its burning gaze. Her hands fidgeted with the hem of her gown, suddenly acutely aware of every inch of space between them. You don't have to say such things to be kind. I'm not being kind, it said, voice rough. I'm being honest. She ducked her head, overwhelmed by the weight of its regard, by the way it looked at her as if she were something precious rather than broken. For perhaps the first time in her life, Elena was happy. The fortress that had seemed a prison now felt closer to sanctuary. Only one shadow darkened her contentment, a question that came every night without fail. Will you bond with me? And each night she'd reply. I pass through hands but never held, I bind agreements never sealed, I'm worth more than gold when freely given but worthless when compelled. Merchants chase me, but I chase fate. What am I? At first she had feared the consequences of her subtle refusal. Now what truly haunted her were those intelligent black eyes flashing with raw anguish at each repetition. But when she'd imagined herself saying yes, entertained the thought because it was her dear friend, and no one but it had ever treated her so kindly. The thought of bonding with pure shadow, of whatever that binding might entail, made her stomach heave with primal terror. What am I? She'd repeat. The shadow would stay silent, and the next day, everything would start anew. Chapter 6. One morning, instead of being sent to scrub floors, Elena was led to a small chamber tucked away in a quiet corner of the fortress. Inside stood a simple desk with a chair, stacks of blank parchment, several quills, and multiple pots of ink in different colors. His Highness says you're to spend your days here now, preparing yourself for your nightly duties, the prince's second explained, her scarred face unreadable. Elena stared in disbelief. I'm to write, whatever keeps that shadow entertained, the woman muttered before leaving her alone with the precious gift of paper and time. Elena ran her fingers over the smooth parchment, heart swelling. No one had ever given her such a gift, such validation that her stories had worth. In her merchant family, paper was expensive. Ink, a luxury her father would never waste on her frivolous scribbling. That night, Elena entered the shadow's chambers quietly, clutching pages covered in her careful script. The usual words of greeting died on her lips as emotions swelled unexpectedly in her chest. I wrote something different tonight, she said softly. May I read it to you? The shadow settled its massive form across from her, darkness pooling in the chair. Please. Her voice wavered as she began. Once there lived a girl born with a gift that wouldn't obey. In a family where reliable sight meant survival, she alone flickered between worlds, seeing emotions one moment and blind the next. She was trapped in uncertainty, never knowing when her ability would fail. Elena paused, swallowing hard. Her father called her defective. Her brother pretended not to know her when merchants were watching. The guild masters threw stones of rejection and called her unreliable. The shadow remained motionless, only its eyes betraying attention. Each night she would escape into stories, creating worlds where she belonged, where being inconsistent wasn't a curse but simply a different way of being. Elena's voice grew steadier, stronger. No one ever asked to hear these stories. No one cared about the world she built, word by careful word. Those who rejected her for an imperfect gift were fools, the shadow interrupted. A gift is nothing compared to a mind that creates worlds from nothing but imagination. Elena looked up, startled. Is that how the story ends? I don't know yet, she admitted. Silence fell between them, charged with something Elena couldn't name. Today, for the first time, someone gave my stories value, she whispered. You asked the prince, who clearly despises you, to give me time and space to write. No one has ever. Her voice broke. No one has ever seen me before. Not until you. The shadow's form flickered and condensed, as if it wished to reach for her, but dared not. I see nothing but you, Elena. The way it said her name sent a shiver down her spine. Will you bond with me? It asked, the familiar question laden with new weight. Elena's breath caught. Her heart raced. The silence stretched between them, fragile as spun glass. Elena, the shadow asked softly. She looked at it. Truly looked at the massive formless shape, the shifting darkness, the complete absence of any human feature save those terrible black eyes. And beyond that, to the mind she'd come to know. The sharp wit, the thoughtful questions, the careful way it never pushed when she said no. The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility. I pass through hands but never held, I bind agreements never sealed, she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. What am I? There was a beat of silence through which the shadow met her eyes, and then its form seemed to collapse inward slightly, defeat written in every shadow line. As she left that night, her heart felt heavier than it ever had upon departing those chambers. Later, sleep eluded her. Elena stared into the darkness of the servants' quarters, remembering every moment of her life before the fortress. The crushing loneliness of being the only one whose gift wouldn't cooperate. The painful silence when she entered the guild hall. The way her father's eyes slid past her, as if looking directly at his defective daughter, might somehow make the failure more real. Then came the shadow. The shadow who spent hours listening to her stories, who'd arranged a writing space for her. Tonight it had called her storytelling more valuable than any reliable sight. A memory surfaced. The shadow asking about her protagonist's choice to forgive someone who'd hurt her deeply. Because sometimes, she'd answered, we see beyond what others have done to who they truly are underneath. Wasn't that exactly what had happened between them? She had seen beyond the terrifying exterior to the person within. And it had seen her, really seen her, when no one else bothered to look past her failures. Elena sat up suddenly, heart pounding. The truth crashed over her like a mountain avalanche. She loved it, not with the cautious affection one might feel for a friend, but with the soul-deep certainty of recognition, of finding someone who understood the language of her heart without translation. She had to say it. Now, before the sun rose, before courage failed her, before another day passed without it knowing that its question finally had a different answer. The fortress corridors were silent in the pre-dawn hours. When she reached the shadow's chambers, the guard slumped against the wall, snoring softly. She slipped past him without difficulty. Inside, the first hints of dawn light had just begun filtering through the heavy curtains. The shadow lay in its bed, or rather, pooled there, darkness at rest, those black eyes closed for the first time she'd ever seen. Elena approached quietly, heart pounding. She would wake it, tell it yes, accept the bond. But then the first ray of sunlight streamed across the bed, and suddenly the shadow convulsed. A sound escaped it, pain raw and visceral. The darkness twisted, contracted, began to take form. Limbs emerged from void. Features carved themselves from nothing. Darkness became flesh. Elena pressed a hand to her mouth, unable to look away. Where the shadow had been, Prince Cassian now lay, his perfect face relaxed in sleep, his chest rising and falling steadily. The contrast was breathtaking. From incomprehensible horror to divine beauty in moments that defied logic. Without thinking, she reached out, fingers hovering just above his cheek. His black eyes snapped open. For one heartbeat, he smiled at her. A genuine smile that transformed his severe features into something so beautiful it stole her breath. Then awareness dawned. His gaze darted to the sunlight, back to her face. The smile died. "You weren't supposed to see this," he said, voice hollow. "Your Highness," she whispered. Cassian sat up slowly, resignation replacing shock. "A sorcerer's curse," he explained, not meeting her eyes. "By day, the prince everyone fears. By night, the shadow everyone pities. Neither form truly me. The curse will only be broken when I find a bond stronger than that born for a prince. Or in other words, when someone accepts the shadow, knowing nothing of the prince within." "I came to say yes," Elena blurted out. "I was going to accept the bond." "Enough," he cut her off sharply. "Now that you know, whatever you feel is tainted. You've seen both sides. You love a prince, not a shadow." "But I didn't know when I decided," Elena began. "It doesn't matter." The prince turned away, black eyes reflecting nothing. "You should go." By afternoon, Elena found herself in a cart, watching the fortress recede into the mountain mist. Chapter 7. A year passed in the cottage by the eastern trade route. Seasons changed. Caravans came and went. Markets bloomed and faded with merchant cycles. Elena had everything she'd once dreamed of: a quiet room with mountain-facing windows, a writing desk, shelves she'd slowly filled with books purchased with carefully saved coin, and misery. A constant hollow ache that no amount of written words could fill. She wrote prolifically, filling page after page with tales of cursed princes, of misunderstood shadows, of bonds that transcended form and fear. But each story remained incomplete, because without him to question her logic, to challenge her character choices, to make that pleased rumbling sound at her unexpected twists, the words felt hollow. The village folk were cordial enough, if distant. They called her the prince's woman, though none knew the full truth. Some whispered she'd been his mistress. Others claimed she'd been punished and exiled for some offense. Isolation was nothing new to Elena, but this solitude cut deeper. For now she knew what it meant to be truly seen, truly heard, and then to lose it. The news came on a late summer's day, carried by a traveling merchant as Elena purchased supplies for her meager household. "You've heard, I suppose," the woman said, eyes bright with gossip's gleam. "About the royal bonding?" Elena's heart stumbled. "Bonding? Oh yes. Prince Cassian is to bond with Lady Seraphine of the Western Valleys. A powerful alliance, they say. Her family controls half the mountain passes." The woman leaned closer. "The ceremony will be held in the valley square next week. A public spectacle so all might witness. The entire kingdom is invited. That night, Elena stood before her small mirror and made her decision. She would go, not to disrupt or plead, but simply to see him one last time. To know, with her own eyes, that he'd found someone who could break his curse. The morning of the bonding dawned clear and bright, as if the mountains themselves blessed the union. Elena dressed carefully in her finest gown. Simple by noble standards, but finer than anything she'd owned in her merchant life. By midday, the Valley Square had transformed into a spectacle of royal extravagance. Banners in black and silver hung from every building. Garlands of mountain flowers draped across pavilions constructed for the occasion. Guards in polished armor stood at attention, their expressions stern beneath their helmets. Elena found a place along the edge of the crowd, half hidden behind a broad-shouldered farmer and his family. From here she could see without being seen, or so she hoped. The assembled nobility arrived first, a parade of silks and jewels and carefully practiced smiles. Then came the bride's procession. Lady Seraphine was everything Elena was not. Tall, graceful, with the confident bearing of one born to power and certainty. Her gift was legendary. She could see not just emotions but intentions, reading people's true purposes with perfect clarity. The crowd sighed in appreciation. Elena's throat tightened. Of course he would choose such a bondmate. Beautiful, powerful, with a gift that never failed. Worthy of a prince. Had the lady somehow broken the curse? The sun had not yet set. There was no way to know for certain if he still transformed. A hush fell over the square as royal fanfare sounded. Prince Cassian appeared at the far end of the aisle created through the crowd, resplendent in black and silver, his dark hair gleaming in the afternoon sun. He moved with the fluid grace she remembered, head high, shoulders squared, every inch the perfect ruler. But Elena saw what others did not. The slight tension around his eyes, the careful blankness of his expression, the way his hands curled into fists at his sides before he forced them to relax. This was not merely the cold, perfect prince the crowd saw. This was her shadow, the one who had listened to her stories, who had given her paper and quills and a library, who had asked her again and again to bond with him. As Cassian took his place at the altar waiting for his bride, something in Elena's chest cracked open. She knew him, truly knew him, in a way this lady with her perfect gift and perfect lineage never could. She knew his wit, his capacity for gentleness. She knew how his eyes, black as void, lit up at a clever plot twist, how he grew still when deeply moved by a story's turn, how he rumbled with pleasure at unexpected narrative choices. Near her, a burly man shifted, drawing her attention. Something about his movement seemed calculated, too deliberate, too focused. His eyes weren't watching the ceremony, but studying the guard positions. With a start, Elena realized he wasn't here for the bonding at all, but assessing security. Across the square, she spotted another figure doing the same, hand resting too casually near a concealed blade. A chill ran through her. Something was wrong. The royal officiant began the traditional vows. Elena watched through a veil of unshed tears as Cassian stood rigid, his face a perfect mask of composure. Then, suddenly, inexplicably, his gaze lifted from his bride and swept across the crowd. Their eyes met. For one heartbeat, his perfect composure shattered. Pain flashed across his features, raw and unguarded. His face paled, his lips parted slightly as if to speak. Then, with visible effort, he tore his gaze away, returning his attention to the lady beside him. Elena forced her lips into a trembling smile, hoping he had seen it, hoping he understood she wished him happiness. Even as her heart crumbled to dust within her chest. The vows continued. The sun inched lower in the sky. The suspicious figures in the crowd shifted subtly, moving into new positions. And then chaos erupted. Chapter 8. The first scream split the air like a blade through silk. Then came the clash of steel, the shouts of fighting men, and the thunder of boots as royal guards rushed to protect their prince and his bride. Protect His Highness. The captain's voice rose above the chaos. Guards surrounded Lady Seraphine, whisking her away through a side street to safety. But Cassian remained, drawing his sword, the blade flashing in the late afternoon sun. All around Elena, people shoved and pushed in their panic. Someone knocked her to the ground. From her position on the cobblestones, the battle took on a nightmarish quality. Attackers poured from alleyways, mercenaries by their mismatched armor and coordinated movements. Royal guards engaged them with trained precision, steel ringing against steel. But Cassian fought like something more than human. Faster, stronger, as though the shadow he became at night lent him preternatural ability even in daylight. She realized, different forms, same soul. An archer on a nearby roof took aim at the prince's unprotected back, drawing his bow. Without thought, Elena burst from her hiding place. She raced across the blood-slicked cobblestones, colliding with Cassian just as the arrow whistled through the air where he had stood. They crashed to the ground together. His black eyes, those familiar voids she'd gazed into so many nights, widened in shock. "Elena," he breathed, recognition flashing across his face. "You were about to be shot," she replied, gesturing toward the rooftop. Cassian shoved her behind him, rising to his feet. "Go. Please," he pressed urgently. His second appeared, blood streaking her scarred face. "Your Highness, the sun. You must retreat now." Elena glanced westward. The sun hung low, a bloated red orb mere minutes from disappearing behind the mountains. The curse wasn't broken. Lady Seraphine hadn't succeeded. The second tugged at Cassian's arm. "My lord, there's no time." A massive mercenary lunged at Elena, tackling her to the ground. His blade pressed against her throat, cold steel biting into her skin. Another attacker, standing beside the first, called out, "Stand down, your highness, or watch her die." Cassian froze, sword half raised. The second grabbed his arm. "My lord, the sun. You must go." "Release her," Cassian commanded, his voice deadly calm despite the chaos around them. The sun touched the mountain peaks, its lower edge beginning to disappear. "My prince," the second pleaded desperately. "There's no time." Cassian shook her off, black eyes never leaving Elena. Something shifted in his expression. A decision made, consequences accepted. "Take her," the attacker growled, beginning to drag Elena backward. "No," Cassian roared, lunging forward. The sun vanished. Cassian stumbled, a cry of pain tearing from his throat. His sword clattered to the cobblestones. His body convulsed, the fine bonding clothes straining at the seams. Gasps and screams rose around them as nobles and commoners alike witnessed their prince's transformation. His form began to dissolve, flesh becoming shadow, features melting into darkness. His perfectly beautiful face disappeared into formless void, black eyes the only constant as his body became living shadow. The crowd recoiled in horror. Lady Seraphine, who had been fighting her guards to return, froze at the sight, her face draining of all color. But Cassian, the shadow, paid them no mind. His focus remained entirely on Elena. The shadow form that was Cassian launched itself at her captor with terrifying ferocity. No hesitation, no concern for who witnessed his cursed form. Only rage at the threat to Elena. The attacker released her, stumbling back in terror. But he was no match for the shadow's fury. Around them, the battle paused as even the mercenaries gaped at the revelation. Royal guards regained control, driving back the remaining attackers as Cassian tore through their leader. It ended quickly. The attacking mercenary lay dead, dissolved into nothing by shadow touch. And in the center of the valley square stood the shadow, massive and terrible, form rippling with residual fury. Black eyes sweeping the crowd, daring anyone to challenge. It staggered suddenly, a pained sound escaping it. Darkness seeped from a wound where an arrow had found its mark during the fight. The shadow's form trembled, struggling to maintain cohesion. Elena approached without fear. Her shadow, her prince, regardless of form. "You're hurt," she said softly, reaching toward the wound. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry they saw. This is my fault." The shadow shook its massive formless head. "I don't care what they saw, what they think." It winced as pain lanced through its form. "As long as you're safe." Elena placed her hands on either side of where its face would be, touching pure shadow. "I love you," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the silent square. "Shadow or prince, I love you." Something changed in the air, a charge like lightning about to strike. Light began emanating from within the shadow, pulsing brighter with each labored breath. The transformation began, but unlike the usual painful shift, this one seemed gentler, almost willing. Shadow receded, condensing and reshaping. Form emerged from formlessness. Features carved themselves from darkness made flesh. When it finished, Cassian stood before her in human form. Though the sun had long set and stars were beginning to appear. His bonding finery hung in tatters, but his body was whole, the arrow wound healed, leaving only a silver scar. "I don't understand," he whispered, staring at his own hands in the starlight. "The curse," Only when you find a bond stronger than that born for a prince will you be free, Elena quoted softly. That's what the sorcerer told you, isn't it? Cassian's black eyes met hers, confusion and dawning hope warring in their depths. You misunderstood, she continued gently. It wasn't about finding someone who could love the shadow more than the prince. It was about you loving someone else more than you loved being prince. Understanding dawned across Cassian's face, transforming his features. When I chose to save you over preserving my secret, he began slowly. You showed that you loved me more than your crown, she finished. That's what broke the curse. Around them, the crowd murmured in shock. Lady Seraphine had vanished, spirited away by her family. His second approached cautiously, disbelief written across her scarred features. But Cassian saw only Elena. In the middle of the ruined bonding ceremony, he pulled her into his arms. She came willingly, her hands reaching up to frame his face. The face she had known in two forms, the soul she had recognized in both. I love you, he whispered against her hair. Shadow and prince, both parts of me love you. Elena pressed closer, feeling the steady beat of his heart against hers. The crowd, the chaos, the blood. All of it receded until there was only this. Two people who had seen beyond form to the truth of each other's hearts. Trust, she whispered suddenly, pulling back slightly to look into his eyes. The answer to my riddle. I pass through hands but never held. Trust can't be forced. I bind agreements never sealed. Trust makes bonds without contracts. I'm worth more than gold when freely given but worthless when compelled. Trust given freely is priceless, but demanded trust is worthless. Cassian's laugh was half-sob, his forehead pressing against hers. I knew the answer from the first night you asked me. You did, but I didn't want to force you to bond with me, he said softly. Curse or no curse. I wanted you to choose me freely, or not at all. Around them, his guards began to restore order. The square slowly emptied. But neither Elena nor Cassian moved, holding each other as the stars emerged one by one above the mountains. Trust, he murmured again, tasting the word. You're right. That's exactly what it was. 1 year later, the fortress ballroom glittered with lamplight and the glow of 1,000 candles reflected in polished obsidian walls. Across the marble floor, nobles and merchants danced together in unprecedented harmony, a gathering that would have been impossible before the curse broke. Queen Elena stood at the edge of the revelry, watching her husband move through the crowd. No longer did fear follow in his wake. Instead, genuine smiles and respectful bows greeted Prince Cassian. Now King Cassian, after his father's peaceful abdication, as he stopped to speak with each guest, his black eyes warm rather than cold. So much had changed in a year. The fortress that had once been a place of whispered terrors now opened its doors to all. The servants no longer cowered. The strict hierarchy that had kept merchants beneath nobility had begun to dissolve under their joint rule. After the bonding day revelation, many truths had come to light. He had never been truly cruel, merely desperate to keep his curse hidden, preferring to be feared than closely observed. The fear kept people at a distance where they wouldn't notice the subtle signs of his transformation as sunset approached. Those servants who had attended his particular guest and never returned had simply been relocated to distant villages with generous pensions to ensure their silence about what they'd witnessed. The truth behind the curse had spread quickly throughout the kingdom. How the sorcerer, scorned by the young prince's arrogance and cruelty toward those he deemed beneath him, had split him in two, forcing him to live half his life as the thing he feared most. A shadow without form, unable to command respect through appearance alone. A fitting punishment for a prince who had valued power and beauty above all else. But the curse's breaking had transformed more than just Cassian. It had changed the kingdom itself. Laws had been rewritten. Trade agreements renegotiated to benefit common merchants as well as nobility. The mountain passes were safer now, patrolled not by fearful guards, but by willing volunteers who believed in their king. And then there was the miracle that still made Elena's heart race with wonder. For months after their bonding, she had felt something shift within herself. Her gift, her unreliable, flickering sight, had suddenly stabilized. For the first time in her life, she could consistently see the emotions of those around her, colors swirling in steady patterns rather than chaotic flashes. The royal physicians had been baffled. The same woman they'd examined and pronounced permanently inconsistent now possessed one of the strongest, most stable sights in the kingdom. Elena liked to think it was love that had worked the miracle. Her husband had bonded with her knowing her gift might never work properly, had chosen her despite what the world called her greatest failing. Perhaps that kind of love, pure, unconditional, transformative, had been powerful enough to heal what everyone believed was permanently broken. Or perhaps, she sometimes thought, her gift had never been broken at all. Perhaps it had simply been waiting for her to trust herself as much as Cassian trusted her. She touched her still flat stomach, smiling at the secret she'd discovered just that morning. New life growing within her. Unexpected, impossible, and wholly welcome. She would tell him tonight, after the celebration ended. Elena paused as she neared her husband, overhearing his conversation with a visiting merchant lord. "A riddle, your majesty," the man was saying. "They say you're quite skilled at them." "I enjoy a good puzzle," Cassian admitted with a smile that transformed his severe features. The smile he wore often now, so different from the mask he'd shown the world before. "Very well. I pass through hands but never held. I bind agreements never sealed. I'm worth more than gold when freely given but worthless when compelled. Merchants chase me, but I chase fate. What am I?" Elena froze, her breath catching. Her riddle. The one she'd posed on that first terrifying night when she'd been certain she would die. Cassian's black eyes flickered toward her, a small smile playing at his lips. "That's simple," he replied. "Trust." The merchant lord laughed, impressed, and moved on to another conversation. Elena approached, unable to hide her surprise. "You knew the answer," she said quietly. "All this time." Cassian took her hand, bringing it to his lips. "Since the first night you asked me. But you said you didn't know. I didn't want to force you to bond with me. Curse or no curse." He drew her onto the dance floor, their movements perfectly synchronized after a year of practice. "I wanted you to choose me freely, to trust me enough to accept both forms, shadow and prince alike. And if I had never figured it out," she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Then I would have remained cursed," he said simply, "and counted myself blessed anyway, for whatever time you chose to spend with me." Elena felt tears prick her eyes. "I have something to tell you," she whispered. He pulled back slightly, black eyes searching her face with sudden intensity, the colors swirling around him. Visible to her now with perfect clarity, shifted from calm blue to vibrant gold. Hope and joy and barely contained excitement. "You can see it?" she asked softly. "I can see you trembling," he said, voice rough with emotion. "I can see you smiling even as tears fall. Tell me, my love. Tell me what makes you look at me like that." "We're going to have a child," she whispered. The ballroom seemed to stop. Or perhaps it was just that Cassian went completely still, his black eyes widening in shock and wonder. Then he laughed, a sound of pure joy that Elena had never heard from him before the curse broke. He lifted her, spinning her around as nobles and merchants alike turned to stare. "A child," he breathed, setting her down gently and cupping her face in his hands. "Elena, my Elena, are you pleased?" she asked, though the golden light of his joy nearly blinded her sight. "Pleased." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "I am blessed beyond measure, beyond anything I deserve." "We both are," she whispered against his mouth. Around them, the celebration continued, but they stood in their own small circle of light. A merchant's daughter who'd learned to see beyond appearances. A cursed prince who'd learned that true power came from vulnerability, not fear. "I love you," he murmured. "My storyteller, my queen, mother of my child." "And I love you," she replied, touching his face, the face she knew as well in darkness as in light. "My shadow, my prince, my heart. One soul in perfect harmony at last. Two forms, two people, but one unbreakable bond built on the strongest foundation of all. Trust freely given, love freely chosen, and the courage to be seen, truly seen, for exactly who they were."